Okay, so could you get started by maybe introducing yourself?
Mhm. I'm Maria Diaz. I'm what I call a dyslexia sort of expert, and a dyslexia tutor based in New York City. I've been in Boston and I lived very briefly in the peninsula, actually. And a lot of what I do is rooted in very early in my career. I had a group of students who didn't know how to read, and I did not know how to teach them how to read. And so that has really driven what I do now. And so I've presented at the International Dyslexia Association. I've sought training in how to teach children how to read. And what I noticed as I sought access to all of these programs and sought access to teach the students within my classrooms how to read was that in general, the wealthier the district or the wealthier the school where I taught, the better the access it was, the better the access was to resources. So, like in the New York City public schools, which is where I started, there like we had a high rate of students with learning disabilities, and yet really like or in Gillingham, I didn't hear it in my first year, didn't hear it at all, didn't had no idea what it was. I like phonics, no, like whole language. We were still talking about it. It was 2010. We were still talking whole language. I had no idea what phonics was. I had a fourth grade student who could not decode. I had no idea how to tackle it. People were telling me to give him basal readers. Um, so that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, that was really great. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired you to start teaching.
So I started teaching really because I didn't quite know what else to do. I went to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and 2010 was right in the middle of the 2008 recession. And for a long time, I wasn't sure what my career path would be. And I went to liberal arts college. I studied sociology, and I was hyper focused on educational inequities, having myself gone through the New York City public school systems and then living in New England for college and viewing access that a lot of my peers in my college classrooms had that I didn't necessarily have, um, through my own educational experiences, having gone to New York City public schools and wanting sort of to be an agent of change. And sort of, I was this bright eyed young 21-year-old thinking that somehow by myself I could enact this change. And so, what inspired me to go into teaching was this naive thought that perhaps by myself I could generate change.
Thank you so much. That sounds great. So since our topic for today is like dyslexia rumors, basically, so I was wondering, like, so there's like a bunch of different myths that I'm pretty sure many of us have heard about dyslexia. So could you just start off by telling us like what exactly is dyslexia?
Mhm. Dyslexia is a disorder of phonological processing that many people misunderstand as a reading disability based on just print. So, whenever I speak to people about dyslexia, let's say it's a parent, or a student, they misunderstand it as, oh, that must mean that they read letters backwards. And really, it's about the sound system. So the way that somebody's brain is processing sounds makes it so that the way that they read the words isn't necessarily the way that somebody who's non-dyslexic like myself, um, is then processing that sound. So some of us are more able readers, not because we're super intelligent, but because our phonological processes are more intact. And so it really is a neurological deficit, believe it or not, and it's tied to our brain function and brain capacity. And it doesn't really have to do with IQ. It has very little to do with like actual letter correspondence. It has very little to do with like reading backwards. It's not like you look at water and read the word backwards. That's not at all what it is. And I want to squash that because I many times I hear people thinking that that's what it is, and even parents who have dyslexic kids still thinking that that's exactly what their kids are going through. And that misconception makes it very difficult for kids to then get the intervention that they need when parents don't know what the intervention their kids need is.
Yeah, and I think you kind of just led into our next question. Like dyslexia is some people think that it's like a sign of kids being like below average intelligence or something, which is obviously like not true. And so I was wondering, is there anything that you've observed from some of your students that like disproves that?
So, one thing that I tell a lot of students who are diagnosed with dyslexia is that it's a superpower. And I tell them that to empower them, but also because it's true. A lot of the students that I've had with dyslexia have other abilities that are really, um, I would say, strengthened, in part because their ability to read is a little bit weaker. So let's say like their reading is weak, so let's say their math might be a little bit stronger, or their reading is weak, so they're better coders. Their reading is weak, so they're a lot stronger at doing hands-on activities. So just because a student is dyslexic, it does not mean that they're incapable of doing things that you can do or things that I can do. And it doesn't mean that they can't be hyper successful. In fact, many very successful people do have dyslexia, and it's a common thread about what we regularly talk about when we talk to kids with dyslexia, to make them recognize that it doesn't mean that they're going to be incapacitated for the rest of their lives. And it's not something that's going to follow them forever. And dyslexia does not equal illiteracy. Like, that's not what it means. It doesn't mean that you will not be able to read. It just means it will take a little bit longer and that you need to find the right teacher to teach you how to do it.
Yeah, thank you. There's like a bunch of rumors that children with dyslexia, they need to like try harder to do better in like reading. So like what are something that's like helped your students with their reading skills, or some like learning habits that they've used?
So it actually irritates me that people think dyslexic students need to work harder, because that's not the case. I think teachers need to be better trained, and many of our teachers are not trained enough, and that's not teachers' fault. I think our educational programs across the country are not well equipped enough, because many of our elementary education teachers don't have Orton Gillingham training, don't have any phonics training. We have many students in middle school who still don't have grade level literacy. There are middle schools in New York City, like the literacy rate, I believe at grade level is something like 30%, which is atrocious. And so like it has nothing, yeah. So going off on a tangent there. So it's nothing to do with them having to work harder. It has to do with us as adults having to use our personal agency to make sure that we have the resources we need to make sure that our students can then have what they need to be successful. And what that looks like is providing multisensory instruction. What that looks like is giving them access to Orton Gillingham. What that looks like is not charging them $300 an hour for Orton Gillingham tutor. What that looks like is not putting them at a special school for kids with learning disabilities that we can pay for, that costs $65,000, because not everybody can afford that. And I understand that there are families who can. In New York City, it's very true. In the peninsula, that's very true. In Massachusetts, that's very true. But then there are other families who can't. And something that's very common here, there are families who will unilaterally place their kids at these schools. So they will place their kids at the school. They have never tried public school before. And then they will sue the New York City Department of Education. They're very wealthy families. And then the New York City Department of Education will eventually pay them for the tuition they've already paid for. But then low-income families who actually need those seats can't do that, because you just don't have that money up front to be paying for that tuition. So what we need to do is we need to think about these processes, like, how is this even equitable that this is possible, that you can unilaterally place your kid in a school, when the whole premise of IDEA was that you need to try our public schools and prove that they failed you before you can just decide, okay, the public school is going to fail my very wealthy white son, and so I'm going to put him at this like very expensive elite private LD school instead.
Yeah, that was great. So also, could you please like, tell us about how like diagnosing someone with dyslexia works? Like, what's the process?
Excellent question. So that standard should be going to a neuropsychologist and getting a diagnosis, which right now is a SLD in reading. And the standard batteries are the CTOP, which anybody who is looking for dyslexia diagnosis absolutely must make sure that their neuropsychologist is doing the CTOP, because that's a test of phonological processing. And I can't stress that enough, because I've seen neuropsychs where that test isn't done, and then where at the end they say this child does not have dyslexia, and I'm like, you can't actually say that because you didn't do this test. And so several batteries are done. They do IQ testing, they do that, they do various other academic batteries, and it's over several days. Sorry. So it's quite a process, but you can also do IEP-based testing through the district. It will not be as thorough, but it can get you a specific learning disability diagnosis. Some states, it depends on the state, will write down dyslexia. Other states will not. They're allowed to, but a lot of states refuse to do it. Why? It's unclear to me. But but it's really a test of, I don't know, it's a test of people not really understanding what they can and cannot do, and the federal government constantly changing hands and leadership, and people not understanding what their roles are, I believe. Um, so the diagnosis part, I think, can be kind of hard because the best time to diagnose dyslexia really is in the early grades, but a lot of kids get diagnosed, I think, too late personally, because they're diagnosed in what I call testing grades. So third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade. And at that point, if you can't read, you've really lost a lot of ground, because like if you're in sixth grade and you're reading at a first grade level, like it's really a bad spot to be in, because you're going to need a lot of intervention. And so what I find personally, especially in a city like New York, where we have a lot of wealth and like a lot of privilege in the city, but also a lot of poverty and a lot of hunger. And so we have two huge extremes. Like we have celebrities and we have like a lot of poverty. So I find that the people who are like at the higher end are able to pay for these extreme tutors and are able to pay for their kids to get the absolute best. So they might identify their kids in fifth grade, but those kids are fine in sixth grade. But then we have the other kids who are identified in fifth grade, and those kids drop out. And it's just like completely inequitable. And I don't understand how those two realities can coexist, knowing that all this money exists within the same sphere.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really great. Also, some people say that like dyslexia is something that can be like cured, and then some other people are saying that dyslexia is like a lifelong thing. So, like, what are your opinions about that?
Dyslexia cannot be cured, but it can be remediated. So that I want to stress very specifically. You live with dyslexia for all of your life. So test batteries might show improvements in your scores. It doesn't mean that you're no longer dyslexic. It just means that you got the interventions necessary to improve your test scores. It does not necessarily mean, oh, look, I'm suddenly not dyslexic. It's like the equivalent of, let's say, a cancer patient, I don't know, getting radiation therapy. But there will always have been like a cancer survivor, right? So sorry, I apologize for that. But dyslexia can never necessarily be cured because it is a deficit of phonological processing. So you're learning these skills through your phonics tutor who's teaching you skills for phonological processing. And so you'll notice these differences, especially in kids who are not getting the right type of intervention. So a student who will do only basal reading, so like an intervention that's very popular in Massachusetts, for example, is reading recovery, which is where they will read a book for 6 or 12 weeks. I don't remember. But it's like a book that they'll study for like they'll memorize the book, and it's for first graders. They'll memorize a book for like 6 or 12 weeks. And if they have the book fully memorized at 6 weeks, great. We've remediated them. They're cured. Great job. Like they've gotten the intervention. But actually, you've done nothing because they've memorized the book. So those kids, when you test them at the end with the CTOP, there's no improvement. But if you give those same kids phonics instruction, you'll see a huge improvement. So yeah, you can remediate dyslexia, but you can't necessarily cure it.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. I think we've got like a bunch of really insightful information from you today. So for our last question, I was wondering, this is more of like an opinion kind of. So like, if you could describe dyslexia in one word, what would it be and why?
Empowering. And I would say empowering because the kids who I work with who have dyslexia, although at first they kind of feel kind of dejected, I would say, eventually they sort of come into that identity in the same way that you might find someone comes into a personal identity, like let's say Latinidad or something else. They really come into it and sort of become advocates for ability and disability in a way that you might find somebody who has a much more visible disability would. And so that to me personally is very rewarding, because then they become very vocal advocates for equity in education and for IDEA and for Americans with disabilities, even though like across the board, they're not necessarily always benefiting from those things.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here today. Like, we definitely got a bunch of very interesting and insightful information from you. So we thank you so much for taking your time for this interview.
Thank you.